Chapter 6 Estoliana. Obedience is our first lesson as acolytes. We learn the virtue in following directions that seem unimportant, so we will give greater attention when we discover what will be required of us as the sons of Zacharias. Timoteo Salazar, Capítulo 48. Zacharias dragged the unconscious woman onto the stone-riddled beach. Water poured down his face as he looked back the way they came. There was no sign of the ship. It either sank or was pulled away by the fierce currents. The heat of the winter sun beating down on his neck pulled his attention away from the mystery woman. Streamers of once ominous clouds were rushing away, leaving the sky a bright, unblemished blue. He looked around, but couldn't see any place more comfortable than the rocks he was already standing on. His medical knowledge was limited to the ways to tend a wound in battle, and how to breathe life into someone who drowned and was no longer breathing. But she was breathing already. He could not revive her, but he could move her away from the swirling waves above the high tide mark. She would have to wake on her own. Stooping, he picked her up, groaning at the effort it took. Normally, he would have no issue in lifting a woman of her height and weight. He ignored his physical discomfort and focused on a tree with pleasant-smelling, unseasonable lavender-colored blossoms. He laid her gently in the shadow of the tree and then leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to catch his breath. Where did she come from? There weren't any women on the Ankamoon. She was young and beautiful. He would have heard if any of the men had a woman on board. He looked up and down the shore, but could not see any of his companions from the Ankamoon. All he could see were dozens of crates, large and small, washing up onto the rocky shore. The ship must be a victim of the sea. At the thought of Cayman, Captain Kefares, and the other men on the ship, he had to bow his head in prayer to the seven deities. Guide my companions, all who lived and worked upon the Ankamoon, that they might discover paradise in the life after this life. After a moment of thought, he added, The two boys, Isol and Lundar, please guide them as well. He felt better when he opened his eyes. When he got his strength back, he decided to secure the crates. As salvage of a ship that sank, the erstwhile cargo was the property of those who recovered it. The inhabitants of the island might be hostile. He could bribe them with the items originally destined for the pharaoh. If the island was uninhabited, then he might need to use them to obtain a berth on a passing ship. Aside from those considerations, Zacharias was not an idle man. He could not relax while some of the cargo was about to be swept back out to sea. During a pause in his work, he looked over to where he left the woman and saw she was sitting up and looking around. He waved in her direction before returning to his work. He was trying to move a huge crate, but it kept stubbornly hanging up on the rocks. On his next effort, it finally began to move. It was only as he succeeded in pushing it above the high tide mark and towards the tree line that he saw a pair of shapely hands had joined his, providing the extra power necessary to complete the job. He wiped the sweat and salt off his brow and turned to look at her. What language do you speak? He used the dialect from a coastal region of Anoxes, hoping she would understand him. I speak several languages, she responded with clear, unaccented Anoxian. I am called Zacharias. Estoliana. She looked up and down the rocky coast. This is pequeño. It is tiny to those passing it in ships, and large to those walking her shores. He tried to judge the size of the island from what he could see. It doesn't appear very small to me. Of course it doesn't. That's part of the legend. How do you know so much about it? He asked. I heard this ship would be passing near Pequeño. I hoped I would be close enough so I could swim ashore. Not sure how to respond to that assertion, he straightened up and looked away from her. He saw several other crates the tide would likely reclaim if they were not moved out of reach of the waves. He returned to his job. When she joined him and continued to help him with his self-imposed task, he asked, Why would you want to come here? My father wished to wed me to the captain of the guard at Anoxes, the cruel man known to beat his wives. I left. I am not a dutiful daughter. Yes, but why come here? She looked around. Who would not wish to live their life in paradise? For a while they worked together in silence, moving the smaller items well beyond high tide, pushing the larger, heavier ones as far up the shore as they could. What sort of people live here? Zacharias asked. She cocked her head to the side, looking at him as if he was peculiar. With a small smile tilting the corners of her mouth, she said, The legend of Pequeño says it will not be inhabited until... Her voice suddenly changed.